So, in looking at the lectionary text for this week, which included the one I just read, my first impulse was just to skip over this passage from Mark. I mean, with all its talks about demon and Satan and houses divided and the unpardonable sin, I was pretty sure there wasn't anything in this passage that I wanted to tackle. But the more I thought about it, the more I looked beyond the obvious, the surface, to what Jesus was saying, the more it seemed that this text is one I not only want to preach on, but one I need to talk about. Why? Because this passage, I think, gives us an important insight into Jesus' thinking about family and who constitutes our families. And given who we are as a church and the much anticipated Supreme Court ruling on same-gender marriage due out later this month, this passage, in a way, could not be more timely or more relevant than it is. So here goes. I want to start by referring back to a sermon I did earlier this year on the desert Abbas and Ammas of 4th through 6th century Christianity. As you may recall, I just returned from a 5-day academy for spiritual formation where I'd received a refresher course on early monasticism from my friend and former seminary professor and advisor, Dr. Roberta Bondi. In one of those sermons, I used an illustration from one of Dr. Bondi's lectures, which is also included in her book, To Love as God Loves. And the illustration was that of a circle with a center point and lines being drawn from the edge to the center, which represent human beings. At that time, I didn't have a visual representation for you to look at, but this morning I do. And it's kind of gotten lengthened out. It's supposed to be a circle. It started out a circle, but sometimes when you put it in a presentation, it changes. But look at it, if you will, just for a moment. So God is that center point. And I didn't fill out the whole circle, but those lines that are drawn from the circumference of the circle to the center represent human lives. And here is what Dorotheus of Gaza, a monk who lived in the 6th century, invited his hearers to imagine about this circle and these lines. He said the straight lines drawn from the circumference to the center of the lives of human beings. To move toward God, then human beings move from their circumference along the various radii of the circle to the center. But what you'll notice is at the same time they are moving closer to God as they move from the outside to the center, what else is happening? They're also moving closer to one another. And I just love this illustration because what it basically says, we can't move closer to God unless we also move closer in our love to the people God has placed all around us, right? The closer we become to God, the closer we become to each other and vice versa. Well, throughout his ministry, I think Jesus sought to draw his hearers into a deeper relationship with God, deeper into the circle, if you will, and thus deeper into relationship with each other. And he defines the circle not as a place for people who have some shared affinity or who necessarily think the same way or who hold all the same beliefs in common. Rather, for Jesus, the circle is wide. And it includes all those who, as he puts it in today's passage, do God's will. And those people, he says, are family. Now, family is a foundational concept in the Bible. It's about as foundational as anything else there is. After all, the Bible begins all the way back in Genesis, not with talk of nations or tribes, but of families. Big families. Real families. Messy families. Families with instances of dysfunction so great it makes your head spin. and gives one pause at the phrase that's thrown around a lot these days of biblical family values. I'm just saying. Of course, there are other metaphors used in the Old Testament to describe the relationship between God and humankind, like king and kingdom, master and slave. But it almost always comes back around to this idea of family. More often than not in the Bible, we are referred to as what? Children of God. You've been listening. Thank you. And children of God makes us, by definition, members of God's family. Which brings us back to today's passage and Jesus' definition of who is his family. On the day when Jesus' family comes looking for him, to restrain him, as some versions put it, or as the Common English Bible that I read from says, to take control of him, for as Mark tells us, people were saying that he had gone out of his mind. The crowd tells Jesus, your mother and your brother and sisters are outside, asking for you. He replies, who are my mother and my brothers? And then looking at those around him, Jesus says, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Now, some people over the years have misread this passage and see Jesus as being disrespectful of his family of birth. But be assured, Jesus knows what it means to be family. And he is not in any way disrespecting his family at all. For it is from them that he first learned to treasure the bonds of kinship. Bonds that he now draws upon as an image and model for the relationship that he seeks to have with us. The relationship God wants with each of us. Jesus simply has a notion of family or kinship that goes deeper and I think broader than ours often does. In other words, Jesus draws his circle wide, calling us to be kinfolk to him by doing what? The will of God, what God desires of us. And if we're kin to him, then we're kin to each other with all the delights and heartaches that come with learning to be a family. You see, I think that in this passage, Jesus is expanding the very definition of family to mean a web of relationships that opens up places within it for a whole host of others. Jesus moves our understanding of family as simply a place of genetic origins, which to be sure does a great deal of good in terms of protecting and continuing life itself. But he moves us from that to an understanding of family as being a group of people that is marked instead by the choices we make. Remember what he said? Whoever does the will of God is my mother and my brother and my sister. It's about choices. And personally, I think this is a much better definition of biblical family values than the one bantered around by those on the far right who oppose marriage equality in our society today. I mean, this definition, if you look at the Gospel of Mark, comes straight from the mouth of Jesus, the one who claims it. And it's certainly more descriptive of the definition of family we find here at Journey of Faith and at churches like ours all around the world. You know, one of the things I appreciate most about our church is that you can find here on any given Sunday just about every configuration of family you can think of. The so-called traditional families, mom and dad, 2.5 kids, blended families, families of one, single persons, empty nest families, families with biological kids, families with adopted kids, families with foster kids, some families with a combination of all three. Families with two moms, families with a single mom, like mine, families with multiple generations living in the same house, like mine, grandparents raising grandchildren, basically families of all shapes, sizes, and colors. You name it, we got it. The thing we all have in common is our belief in Christ and our desire to do God's will, which makes us not only a part of God's family and a family in God's eyes, but also a part of this family we call Journey of Faith. I think I've told you this story before, but if I have, bear with me. When I had the opportunity to adopt Hunter, Hunter's biological grandparents were at the hospital the day he was born. And I was in the room when he was born and had the great joy of seeing him born, which was a tremendous gift to me. But later that day, his paternal grandmother, Joe's mom, came to me and she was really upset because Joe's dad, Rodney, wouldn't come and see Hunter because he was afraid he would never see him again. And I tried to explain to him before Hunter was even born that my intention was that ours would be a truly open adoption and that they would always have a place in Hunter's life. And, I really didn't know what that would look like. I mean, it's not the typical model of adoption, but it's what I wanted. And so I remember sitting in one of the rooms at the Women's Center at St. David's Round Rock and sitting down with Ora, who I barely knew, and talking about this. And I said, I know you don't know me very well, but I just got to tell you, my understanding, my definition of family is really broad. I've spent 20-something years pastoring United Methodist churches. And every church I've served has, in a sense, become my family. Now, I really believe that family is who we make it. And the second thing I believe strongly, is that no child can be loved too much. And so she went home and she talked to Rodney, and that day he came up and he fell in love with that little boy, just as we all did. And now Rodney is his papa, who he adores. And Hunter has this whole big, wide, non-traditional family that loves him and who he loves. And I think it's because he is loved so much by so many that he got the Heart of Gold Award in his grade in school this year. And I'm proud of that. Can you tell? Yeah. Well, in this morning's gospel reading, Jesus expands the definition of family. And he draws a wide circle of inclusion with his description of who constitutes his own family. His family is whoever does the will of God. That's who makes the cut. No wonder his flesh and blood kin were wondering about his mental state. I mean, when you think about it, well, back then, this was radical stuff. Apparently, for some folks, it's still radical stuff today. But then that's who Jesus was, isn't it? That's what he was all about. Radical inclusiveness of those that others wanted to keep outside the circle. But he fought and fought and fought to always draw the circle wide. So I invite you today to come to the table where all are truly welcome. Because at the table set by this Jesus, the Christ, a table in which there is room for all, love for all, space for all. Folks, this is not an impossible dream we are living. This is simply one big, hopeful, yet slightly dysfunctional family we call church. So come and eat. And come and know that you are a beloved child.